Yo ho ho! So today I'm going to talk about my best and worst reads of 2017. Now, I read 20 books in 2017, which, it's not the worst, but it's not the best. I had set my reading challenge on Goodreads to 50 books because I'd done so well in the previous year that I thought that 50 was an attainable number for me. I was proved to be very, very wrong by this, but oh well, life gets in the way. Also, it was a very bland reading year. There wasn't a lot of standout reads. There was no 5-star reads for me, which is quite disappointing because there's normally at least one 5-star book a year. So it's sad that I didn't really add anything to my favourites. So let's start with my worst books of 2017. So the first book I want to talk about is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. This was so disappointing on so many different levels. I went into it thinking that this was going to be one of my favourites. It turned out to be extremely dull and tedious, and I didn't like the writing style. Now, I've only ever read one previous true crime novel, and that was Helter Skelter, and that was completely gripping and enthralling for me. I couldn't wait to get home to read it. This, I couldn't wait to be done with it because it wasn't gripping in my opinion. The murders themselves didn't really interest me. The story of the killers didn't interest me at all. I was expecting that the writing was going to have some sort of flourish to it because it's Truman Capote and he was such an extravagant sort of character. This book read to me as like, this is a book about being serious. This is a serious book. We're going to be serious with this book. The other thing that I struggled with is when it came to describing the murders in the house, I had a very hard time visualizing the house because there's no photographs in it. I'm not a very visual person. At least like if you have a true crime novel, you should include the blueprints of the house so that you can at least know like this is where the killers entered, this is the first bedroom they hit, just to help out the people like me who can't really get a good clean image of it just from the description. Yeah, so quite disappointing since I thought it was going to be a favourite and it just wasn't. Next up is Heavier Than Heaven, which is a biography on Kurt Cobain's life. Now this, I don't even know how long I was reading this for. I threw it in my work bag one day because, I like having something to read when I'm on lunch break. So it was in there for like a good 6 months or so. It was just really hard to get through. What I really didn't like about this is that it adds its own narrative. The best example I can give you is that at the end of the book, the author speculates what are the last thoughts that goes through Kurt Cobain's head before he shoots himself. And there was a lot of that kind of input that you can't base any truth on because it's like you can't know what's going through someone's head. You can't think, imagine what the last thing someone thought of before they shoot themselves. And so to have it in a book as if it's fact, I thought it was quite ridiculous, and there was a lot of those points in the book. Now, like, the story is interesting enough, especially if you're one of those people who believes that Courtney Love had anything to do with his suicide. It sheds a lot of light on their relationship, the fact that he was the one to get Courtney into heroin and that she was desperately trying to get him off of heroin and try to be, his savior, but he just succumbed to his own mental illness. I love reading a bit of kind of trash. I love reading biographies and stuff about celebrities, but maybe it wasn't the right time for me to read it. I mean, I've heard really great reviews of it before, but I just really didn't enjoy it at all. Another book that I really didn't like was The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa. Now, I was absolutely pumped to read more Yoko Ogawa because I really enjoyed her novel Revenge, which is a short story collection that are like horror related, but just really smart and interesting. The Housekeeper and the Professor was just an utter letdown. Now, I went into it knowing that it probably wasn't my cup of tea, and I was kind of proved to be right because it's not a love story, but it kind of is. Like, there's not really a romance in it, but it's about a professor who has a problem with his memory. Basically, he starts over every day or like every hour, something like that. His memory starts over. He has to keep reintroducing himself to his housekeeper, and a lot of his housekeepers who worked for him previously can't stand him. He's a professor of maths, so there's a lot of like mathematic equations in it, which, wasn't particularly enjoyable for me because I don't really enjoy that. And it's just kind of about this housekeeper who starts to work for him and her son, and she starts bringing over her son. They kind of cross some barriers in a work sort of relationship they probably shouldn't cross. It is what it is. Like, I can see why people would really enjoy it, but it wasn't my cup of tea. And considering that I'd gone from such an extreme book like Revenge to something that was completely different, kind of took me by surprise. Then I also read The Valley of the Dolls. I did like it, but I kind of left a sour taste in my mouth. So Valley of the Dolls is a story that takes place over a couple of decades about these three women, three friends, and like what happened to them. And it's kind of a story about how they kind of succumb to society and the men in their lives. And it's quite a depressing read by the time you get to the end of it. It's a lot about vanity and maintaining your looks as you get older. It's something a lot of women have to deal with. And I know that there's a lot of women who are like these characters out there, but I just found it really depressing and not in a good way, and the ending really bummed me out, and you can kind of expect it. I enjoyed it for what it was. Like, it is a bit of trash reading. I would regard it as like a binge read type of thing. Like, you do consume it quite quickly. It's an alright story, but again, it wasn't really my cup of tea either. And the last really bad book, I think I gave this 1 star now that I think about it, is a book called Universal Harvester. I can't even remember who it's by, but I'm actually not listing out authors at all because I don't care. It was at the start of the year, springtime, that I picked up this book. I had seen a few reviews on it. It's a horror book, and I like to kind of read indie horror just so I have some different recommendations when it comes to making horror recommendation videos. And this Universal Harvester sort of caught my attention. It's about a guy who in the early 90s works in a VHS store, and one day someone returns a tape to him and claims that there's something wrong with the video, that there's some other video on it. So immediately when I read that, I was like getting Ring vibes. I was like, ooh, this is going to be interesting. I love this kind of stuff. And it turned out to be utter dog shit. The first half of the book was kind of okay. The descriptions of what was on the various different tapes wasn't great. Basically what happens is that as the tapes are reviewed, it's discovered that it's someone in the town who is recording onto these tapes in a barn, in an abandoned barn. It didn't make it clear what was actually happening. Like, I can't remember if it was like women who were being tortured in it or what, but it was just very unclear. And it was very confusing too, because like it jumps from first person to third person. It jumps all over the place with the narrative, and you can't really tell who's talking or what's going on. I wouldn't consider it a difficult read or anything like that, but it was just so all over the place. And the second half of the book just completely goes off track, and there's not really much of a plot. Like, at the beginning you have this setup, but then it just kind of goes off a cliff, and it's like the book forgets where it was actually supposed to be going, and it was just not great. It wasn't great. So those were the worst books of 2017. So let's get on to my best books of 2017, and I'm going to start with White Noise. So I've wanted to read this for a really long time. I think I got it for last Christmas or my birthday or something like that. And I knew I was going to really enjoy it because the main themes are consumerism and death. So it's about John Gladney and his family, and he is a professor of Hitler studies. So like from there, it's already got me. Basically, himself and his wife are utterly afraid of death. It's something that they think about constantly. And then this event happens, this airborne toxic event happens, and Jack is exposed for a couple of minutes to the air and is then like riddled for the rest of the book with the thoughts of that, like he's definitely going to die one day, and like this is what's going to kill him. It's really interesting, and there's a lot of kind of consumerism to this as well. Even though I already read it last year, I already want to reread it because I feel like I missed out on a lot of things due to like having read it on a plane and being distracted by the fact that I'm up in the air and that I might die. It's always good to read books about death when you feel that you might possibly die. It's definitely one that I would recommend. It was just really nice picking up a book and finding that it was to my exact taste. It's so rare that happens these days. So I was just dead pleased with it. Then I want to talk about a graphic novel, which is Last Look by Charles Burns. Now, you might be familiar with Charles Burns because he wrote the Black Hole books. Weird kind of comics, and this one is pretty weird as well. The story of this is that our main character is sitting in bed. He's suffered some sort of head trauma because he's got a bandage wrapped around his head. He's lapsing in and out of consciousness, and he's, taking various medication for the pain that he's in. You kind of go through his life and see all the regrets that he's had, the various relationships, but then it's also paired with these really odd sort of dreams where he's in a very bizarre land with talking to some very bizarre creatures, and there's this whole sort of breeding thing with the women. It's pretty freaking weird. It's quite beautiful in places. It was one of those graphic novels that I just wish that it'd be longer because I enjoyed the story so much. He's basically, I would assume at that stage when he's in bed that he's probably maybe like in his late 30s, maybe early 40s or so. And he's just going throughout his life, like from being a child onwards, like the regrets that he had with his parents and with his various girlfriends and like where he went wrong in his life. And it's just kind of like an interesting manifesto, really. But if you're into like indie graphic novels, maybe horror related graphic novels, it's definitely one to check out, and I would highly recommend it. Next is one I don't have a physical copy of because I got it from the library. It's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson. This was just like I kind of started my year with this. And it was just a bit of a joyride, a bit of a roller coaster of a novel for me. It's Hunter S. Thompson's true life story of writing for Rolling Stone and just being absolutely out of his mind on drugs. He travels to Vegas to write an article on some sort of car race, if I'm recalling correctly, and it's just about the misadventures that himself and his attorney get into based on like all these like concoctions of drugs that they take. I think my favorite chapter was like one, he's obviously like talking into a recorder, because it was just like the majority of the chapter was just like you couldn't understand it, and it just said like inaudible, it was just like inaudible gibberish, but it was just very entertaining. I definitely want to read more of his books because I find him to be a fascinating character. Another book that I wanted to get to for ages and finally read last year was The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Again, it's one that I absolutely loved. Its main theme would be alienation, and that's one of my favorite things to read about. Like I've mentioned that time and time again in other videos, and I definitely want to make a video on like my favorite books on alienation because it's something that like resonates a lot with me. But it was a really interesting read. Like it was funny in places, but it was also terribly depressing. I actually didn't know much about it. I knew that like the main character wakes up as a cockroach one day. I didn't know how it ended or anything like that. So it's always good when you don't have a classic spoiled on you, because it's very rare these days. But the ending was just absolutely heartbreaking. Like it really upset me and resonated with me as well. I found it interesting how quickly, after his family discovered that he'd been turned into a cockroach, how quickly they just forgot that he was actually still a human being with human thoughts and just decided to treat him like utter shit. I definitely want to get a copy of it for myself so I can reread it at some stage. And then finally, my last favourite book of 2017 was The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. And this is a book that is a memoir on Jeanette Walls' childhood, kind of her life as well. I found it a bit off-putting at first because it starts off where she's going down the street and she sees her mother digging through a bin. Her mother is homeless. Just the way she kind of talks about her at first, I found quite off-putting. But then as you get further into the book, you discover like why these feelings happened, why her mother has ended up homeless. It's a rare thing to have a memoir that talks about quite heartbreaking things but can be very light-hearted about it and not look at it like in a comical way, but just not to be horribly serious about it, to be able to look on the lighter side of life. There's a certain incident that happens in this where a man breaks into their house, like a very scary moment in a child's life. And then in the next bit, it's her and her brother where they're walking through the streets with weapons and they try to hunt down this creepy man who broke into their house. That itself made me laugh. It was really nice to read something from a child's perspective. Children kind of fear things in a different way that adults do, and a lot of the time they don't really have the same fears that adults do. But it was just a really good memoir. Like if you are someone who's into memoirs, you should definitely read it. I would highly recommend it. So those have been my worst and best books of 2017. Let me know the worst and best books that you read last year, and I hope you enjoy this video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.